Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's week 1 of season 2 of The Pick List. We're back.
We are back with a bang. How are you?
Yeah, great, thank you. And we've even seen each other face to face, which is for the first time this year over the summer, which was a delight. Nice brunch.
Yes, indeed. So we went to Colour Coats, didn't we? And had a lovely brunch there by the seaside. So that was very nice indeed. Hoping to do a little bit more often in the coming months than we have been able to do. I've moved up here to the northeast and I think seen you less than I saw you when I was back in London. So hopefully that changes soon.
We might even get a face-to-face recording done, you never know. But what it did do was allowed us to plan the next season, which we've just launched, and we've got 14 amazing episodes planned, haven't we?
Yes, we do. Really exciting guests, including this week's guest, Murray King, who's joining us from New Zealand. So it's really exciting for us to broaden our geographical reach as well. And Murray is a brilliant guest. He brought 2 fantastic articles that really made us look at the food industry through a sort of Kiwi lens that we wouldn't normally be doing.
I loved it. Should we start the show?
Murray, welcome to the show. We're so thrilled to have you with us. Could you perhaps briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners how you're connected to the food industry?
Hi guys, hey, real pleasure to be here. I'm connected right at the beginning of the food industry, I guess. I'm a farmer at heart, but I'm reasonably easily bored, so stray into other areas, and so we're involved in selling A2 liquid milk to local processors for local delivery into the cafe trade, but also into making ice cream, A2 ice cream, which we sell into or around New Zealand, Australia, and Southeast Asia at this stage. So that's me, but also heavily embedded right at the beginning of the food chain around some non-executive directorship roles, which I have. One is a large research institute, which is heavily involved in aquaculture, marine and freshwater monitoring, and food data analytics and such like, and also another company, LIC, which is New Zealand's biggest genetics or bovine genetics and agri-tech company. So we're really responsible for generating the next generation of livestock for the industry.
Fantastic. And I think that sort of breadth of interest, the fact that you're quite easily bored, I think is reflected in the articles that you've chosen for us as well. Really exciting to get a slightly different perspective from a different part of the world for us as well. So you have chosen 2 articles that are particularly relevant in a kind of New Zealand and I think to an extent Australian context as well. So why don't you tell us about the first article you have picked for us?
Okay, so the first one is from New Zealand Food Technology News. But the reason I chose this is because it's Maori Language Week here in New Zealand this week. And this relates to a group of Maori company up in the Bay of Plenty who have teamed up with a company in the Waikato called Laiga to extract bioactives from horticultural waste effectively, particularly looking at the likes of kiwi fruit and avocados. And why I think that's interesting at the moment is because with the COVID thing, people are looking at more ways of or better ways of looking after their health, and obviously a key part of that is what they eat. And so these clever people and that company called Laiga is led by some pretty significant scientific people in this country, and also a chap, Sir James Wallace, who's made a small fortune out of dealing with waste, mainly around the meat industry over his career. And what they're looking at doing is just extracting these biopolymers and things and utilizing them for, I guess, as ingredients in other nutraceuticals and things. And the reason I think it's also important that the link with the Maori here is that they really have a really close connection with the land and the environment, and they take a really long-term view. And so the strategic plan of one of the local iwi here, the Wakatu iwi, is that it's a 300-year strategy they look at. So, they're here for the long haul, and so they're really about protecting the environment. And there's a thing called Te Taiao, which is around looking after the natural world. And that has actually been linked in with the new strategy, Fit for a Better World, which has been put together by the Primary Sector Council of New Zealand. And that's looking about how we actually improve everything we do in agribusiness, and also how we extract a little bit more value around the world. Because one of the challenges we have here in NZ is that we're only 5 million people, and yet we produce enough food to feed 40. It's really important that we just make sure that we are differentiating ourselves and making sure that we can do it in such a way which is respectful for the environment and done in a way which people are prepared to pay a premium for. And certainly in a post-COVID world, it seems to be what people are really looking for.
The 300-year plan, which sounds amazing, although the strategic plans I do, if I'm lucky, it's 5 years, so 300 sounds huge. How easy is it to get alignment across industry groups that are maybe more on a trader mentality to a group, as you say, the Maoris, who are looking for a more, I guess, long-term view to protect the land that belongs to them?
I think that this is something which in the last, say, 5 or so years is something which has become more apparent, and it's grown out of a number of initiatives. The biggest one is a thing called the Tahono movement, which has been put together by senior agribusiness leaders, chief executives, chairs, and what they've been doing is taking all those people across to Stanford in California, Silicon Valley, into a deep immersion boot camp for a week. And just looking at how actually we can do things differently as a country, and how we can actually really play upon our natural resources and our point of difference, really. Because at the end of the day, we're stuck down here in the bottom of the South Pacific. We've got to export everything. So we've got to do it in a certain way, and a way which is actually going to generate better revenue and better return back for our country ultimately.
Absolutely. And I thought just that whole topic of using agri-food waste streams in a way that adds value, I think is such a live topic. I think in many countries at the moment. So I was very interested to see that there is that focus on using the materials and really trying to find ways to do something innovative with them. As you say, using some of the compounds to perhaps produce more functional foods or use them as ingredients in those foods. But I guess, from a kind of biopolymer perspective, the whole kind of sustainable packaging debate is obviously very live still as well. So it seems like there's a lot of potential here to really do something quite innovative with these waste streams.
Yeah, absolutely. And Maori agribusiness is so big as well and getting bigger. So they're an important part of the agricultural sector. So
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
So my first pick this week is about PepsiCo and a new sleep-inducing beverage that they're launching. This has been reported quite widely. The article I have picked is from Fast Company, and it's called "PepsiCo Wants to Help the Caffeinated Masses Get Better Sleep with its new relaxation drink." The drink in question is called Driftwell. It comes in a blackberry lavender flavour, and it contains magnesium and a compound called L-theanine, which is also found in green tea. This is a North American launch at this stage, due to go on sale online in December, and then a retail rollout to follow in early 2021. There are 3 things that I thought were really interesting about this launch. The first is the focus on relaxation and sleep. That has been a growing category for some time, but interest in it has been boosted significantly by COVID, which has caused stress, anxiety levels, insomnia to spike. I mean, people talk about coronasomnia as a phenomenon. There's a PepsiCo executive, Emily Silver, who's quoted in this article, and she makes clear the project did start before COVID, but of course, it's now very well timed, really speaks to the mood at the moment. So very timely entry. The second thing that I thought was interesting is the fact that this is a relaxation focused functional product that's not made with CBD. Because we have seen so many launches with CBD that I think there's almost a tendency to think that if you want to play in that kind of relaxation and stress relief category and you want to do more than a slightly soothing tea, then CBD is really your go-to. Not so here. This is the first time they've made any kind of hard functional claim on pack about any of their products. So clearly getting this right and doing this with an ingredient that they feel comfortable with was absolutely important. And there's another article, which I'll link in the show notes as well, from CNBC, where they do sort of allude to some of the regulatory uncertainty surrounding CBD and why that may put off some big food and drink companies from entering that arena at this stage. And again, the PepsiCo executive, Emily Silver, who was also quoted in the Fast Company article, she says in the CNBC piece, rather pointedly, from a scientific and regulatory perspective, we feel really good about making that claim around L-theanine. Specifically, we have safety in clinical data to prove that it works. Third and final thing that I liked about the story is the fact that this product came out of an internal incubator program. This is a program that was started by their CEO last year, and it basically involves a competition where PepsiCo employees come up with ideas for new products, and the winner is then made and turned into a product that's launched. And Driftwell is the first product to come out of this program, and it's also the fastest new product to ever come out of PepsiCo, which I really like. I think that's impressive in its own right. But I thought it's also interesting because we hear a lot about big corporates running incubator programs with startups. But initiatives like this show that there's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit to be tapped from your own employees too. You don't always need to kind of be partnering with an external partner. Murray, what did you make of it? And is that whole sort of debate around functional foods related to stress, anxiety, relaxation, is that a big topic in New Zealand as well?
I think it is, and once again, we're seeing people trying to look after their health better, which is great. When I first read this, maybe I'd had too many coffees, and I misread it, and I thought, why are they trying to have a Coke drink, which actually, or a Pepsi drink, I should say, a cola drink, which I'll get it right eventually. A cola drink, which then puts you to sleep, but that wasn't the case at all. And then when I had another look at it, it's actually water. So it's another way of selling water, which I think is innovative. And if people want to buy it, and the other thing, no sugar, no added carbohydrates and other things, which once again, more functional food. People are trying to differentiate, and if they're prepared to pay for it and they want it, sell it to them.
I was interested by the article as well, and the fact that, and your comments at the end, Julie, about being an incubator project. This is a sort of brand you would see from a startup, and seeing it from a massive FMCG like PepsiCo. I wonder if the type of people that would normally buy health type products would actually, I don't know, is there a trust issue that you've got such a huge company here selling something that's quite niche at the beginning? Is it something that allows it to get exposure to the masses? But then is there also a flip side, if this was on a sub brand, maybe not tagged as PepsiCo, would people maybe buy into it quicker? I'm just thinking that, I don't know, like the UK Innocent Smoothies brand before their takeover, people had that level of buy-in because it felt small. I guess it's like Ben and Jerry's before they're sold to Unilever. Would people want to jump on the back of that quicker because it felt small, it felt niche, but then they don't have the exposure in the channels that PepsiCo would?
I think it's interesting that they've kept it quite separate from the overall PepsiCo brand. So I I'm not sure that it would be a barrier because, you know, we're making that association. And lots of the articles that have covered this make the association with cola and with Pepsi because of the parent company. And you can make all sorts of funny little puns about, you know, a make-up caffeinated beverages is now trying to sort of come out with something that, you know, helps you with your over-caffeination possibly. But I think when you look at the branding and when you look at the proposition on shelf in isolation, I'm not sure that would be a problem. So I think it's really going to come down to the functionality of the drink. I think if a drink like that can deliver on what consumers are looking for, then I don't think having a big parent company would be a hindrance at all. Laura, what's your first pick for us this week?
My first pick this week is from the New York Times, and this is 7 ways the pandemic has changed how we shop for food. And I know we've seen a lot of these articles over the last 6 months or so, but what I really liked about this article is it not only gave the 7 things that are sticking in the States, but it also gave a nice little lead in with some good sound bites from CEOs of different multiple retailers in the US. It talks about how the trends have been turbocharged over the pandemic, and it gives a nice quote that over the first month of the pandemic, it's seen 8 years worth of growth that were predicted in the US retail category. And I guess it also talks about the fact that the US is so food service focused, and the fact that US consumers have gone back into retail obviously in this huge way, and people are as a result moving into more complex cooking, and they feel in this article that a lot of that is going to stick and people aren't going to just default back into eating out of home, that some of these new trends, because they've now been embedded over 6 months, will maintain. Some of the 7 pieces that it picks out throughout the article are things that we know a lot about. You know, the shift to online we know is happening, consumer choice and the rationalisation of ranges, and the move into frozen are mentioned. But there's 4 that I wanted to really pick out and chat about. First of all, fewer trips, and it talks in the article about people are getting better at putting lists together and being better planned in their food shopping throughout the week. And people go with more of a purpose. And I think that's really interesting, and something that the article's saying it's probably going to stick going forwards. And people are, you know, rather than going 3 times a week to the supermarket, they're going once, and they feel that that's going to, I guess, protect them from potential exposure to the virus. Secondly, it talks in the article about the trends is orange is the new snack food, which was really interesting and something we definitely haven't touched on before in our shows. And it talks in the US that produce category is up 11%, and in May alone, oranges were up 73%, and the whole natural movement is gaining momentum all the time, and people getting more into produce rather than processed snack food. It is seeing real growth in the US, which I think is really, really interesting. The third thing I wanted to pull out was about redrawing the store, and this is something that, again, I guess will take a little while to penetrate into the market. But this is around some retailers trialling wider aisles, different sanitation options, making sure that the aisles were less crowded. And it gives an example of Walmart. They've trialling this open plaza for payment and the whole sort of self-check. We know self-check can be quite confined and quite short of space. But some of the retailers are looking how they can do that differently. And it also gives the example of Publix, the big Florida retailer, changing their one-way system, which that they've had for a while, and they're getting rid of that. The third thing that I think, again, is really interesting that I'm keen to chat to you both about is a local, and local being a bigger lure. Locally produced food has seen growth, and waiting lists for community-supported ag subscriptions have seen growth. And it talks about how chefs in the food service market are now producing meal kits, and how locally grown selling routes have maintained. And this is not only about supporting local communities, and it gives a great soundbite in the article about the importance of supporting local that have helped through the pandemic, but also that health aspect too, and how essential that is. What are your thoughts on that? Because the article gives a huge amount. And Murray, if I can come to you first, particularly on maybe local and produce, are these things that the Kiwis are doing, and I feel doing already, but doing more in the light of the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I sympathise with all of these points. I found it fascinating actually, and I think they're really points that actually I think will apply anywhere. As you've said, Laura, people are doing things quite differently. The fruit thing's really interesting, isn't it? The oranges. So
Yeah.
people once again are trying to look after themselves better, and they think if they can improve their immunity in one way or another, more vitamin C is a good thing. So we're seeing that here, actually, down here in New Zealand with Zespri, kiwi fruit, gold kiwi fruit in particular, the marketing company, can't sell enough of the stuff, particularly into Asia, those sort of places, because people are concerned for their health. The local thing was fascinating too, which is frustrating for me because, if everyone buys local, well, they're not going to buy any export stuff, are they? We're going to be sending them. But I do get that, that's something that we see here as well, that people are migrating back to fresh, real food and less processing, all those sort of things, once again, because they perceive that it's better for their health. They also want to support local producers, which is great. And then I guess the other thing is around the number of items on a shelf, and it seems that as someone who sells into that trade, is a bit of concern. If you're not the number one or two, where are you going to end up, and if you're not making the grade, you'll be gone. So actually the ranging is going to be reduced, it would appear. So from a supermarketing point of view, that's something which I think we'll see more and more of. So how that plays out will be really interesting.
I thought it was a really interesting piece. And Laura, as you say, we've seen a lot of these sort of think pieces looking at how shopping has changed, how shopper behaviour has changed, both in the UK, in the US and in other countries. This, I think, it does a really nice job of sort of pulling some of these trends together. And even though it's obviously focused on the US, I think there are a lot of these sort of macro trends that apply across a number of countries. Like both of you, I loved the stat about oranges. It really made me want to see some of the latest sort of Kantar or Nielsen data on fresh produce sales in the UK, because I'd love to see whether we've seen a similar level of uptick for orange sales in particular. And it did make me wonder whether part of it is about sort of having, as you say, sort of natural foods, unprocessed foods, but also foods that already had a reputation for immunity boosting. We've seen so many kind of companies try and position their products around immunity support in the wake of COVID. Are these sort of products, is fresh produce that has a long-standing reputation for having that functionality? Does that have a bit of an advantage under these circumstances?
Murray, what's your second pick this week?
Okay, so my second pick is about Gen Z. So this is about the generation which is born between 1995 and 2015. So these are the digital natives. They have grown up never knowing anything other than the internet. And it's an article which I picked up out of Food Navigator by Oliver Morrison. And what it's saying is that Gen Z are not ready to eat lab-grown meat. So this was a study that was conducted in Australia, and they asked a number of questions of that demographic about what they thought. And consider this is a significant part of the consumer base, and certainly will be influential in the future, because there were about 2 billion of them, and they are very well connected. So with what's happening in the world. And so some of the things they picked up out of this were that, if I just quickly run through a few of these stats. So 17% rejected all alternatives, including cultured meat, saying that it was chemically produced and heavily processed. 11% rejected all alternatives in favour of increased consumption of fruit and vegetables, saying they'd stick with a vegetarian diet. 35% rejected cultured meat and edible insects, but accepted plant-based alternatives because they sounded more natural. 28% believed cultured meat was acceptable or possibly acceptable if the technology could be mastered. And the fifth group, around 9%, accepted edible insects, but rejected cultured meat as it was too artificial and not natural like insects. So I thought that was interesting. The other points that they made was around the fact that they're unsure whether cultured meat is actually more environmentally sustainable. And they described it as potentially resource consuming and not being environmentally friendly. I guess as a food producer, I'm always wary about some of these things, and I like the fact that we go to a lot of trouble to produce a product that we're really proud of, and it's done in a really respectful way. I'm a real supporter and believer in real food, and I think as long as it's done in a managed and ethical way, we can get along together. But I think, I don't think anyone really likes the idea of eating food out of a lab. And I guess it's a little bit like the GMO debate, isn't it? Where we know there's some good science there that can actually help us solve a lot of problems, but the connotations that go with it mean that we're too scared to go there.
I was really fascinated by this article, partly because I'm currently writing a report on Gen Z in the context of grocery. So this immediately sparked my interest. And I think it's really interesting. This is obviously focused on Gen Z in Australia. And so I had a look at some research that came out a few months ago in the UK here about Gen Z's attitudes to foods. And that was a piece of research commissioned by the Food Standards Agency here. And I think to an extent it kind of echoes perhaps some of the reluctance around lab-grown meat. But certainly the message that came through from that piece of research here seemed to suggest that Gen Z actually were quite comfortable with the idea of having technology play a part in the food system. They did, from what I gather, a qualitative rather than a quantitative study here. So I don't have any particular sort of stats to share, but what they wrote in this FSA report was this. Technological solutions feel plausible and sensible to Gen Z, matching their assumption that technology will play a significant role in the future. And there was a sense here also, an intuitive sense that technology will make food production quicker, easier, and more environmentally friendly. Now, on the subject of lab-grown meat, this particular UK study said there was some openness to eating insects or lab-grown meat in absence of alternatives, but they do say this varied widely. So there were a group of sort of Gen Z consumers that kind of, that they call conscious consumers, who were particularly engaged perhaps on sort of environmental issues, who were more likely to eat lab-grown meat than animal meat, but others did feel uncomfortable with the idea and felt that they would need to be strongly nudged, showing a preference for natural over fake. So I think it's just so fascinating when we think about this next generation that's coming through. And as you say, they're digital natives. They're going to be so important to the future of our food system, and their attitudes and the way they feel about different types of foods, but also different technologies that are potentially going to be playing a role in our food system is going to be absolutely critical. So I suspect we'll be seeing much more of this type of research to really try and help food producers kind of gauge where attitudes and behaviours are going.
Fascinating stats. I was just going to say, Maria, the article, as you've touched on there, where it finishes about environment and being able to convey to, and I like the term digital natives because it makes me feel really old when you say, they've been grown up with the internet. How do these folks feel? But you're right, they're going to have something that conveys very quickly and easily what the environmental impact is or isn't compared to naturally grown meat. And I guess that connection, which didn't really come out in the article, but I'm not sure if it was in the FSA report, Julia, about, even a lot of the reports that I see is consumers do feel a huge amount of empathy with our farmers and want to keep connecting with the communities, as we've, just chatted about local before, and this whole corporate faceless organisation producing lab-grown meat is, as the article alludes to, is that something really the next generation are comfortable to buy into? So I think there's a huge communications element within this, isn't there, about how do these big corporates make themselves look, feel smaller and easily convey what the environmental impacts are or aren't, and how that's different. Julia, what's your second article this week?
So my second pick this week is from Sifted, and it's an article by Mimi Billing called "Future Foods Are Not Made of Plants, They Are Made of Air." So we're kind of continuing our conversation about technology and alternative proteins as well, in a way, and see what kind of role they're going to play in the future. This particular article is about a Finnish startup called Solar Foods, which makes an alternative non-meat protein from electricity, water and air. Now, this startup has got a fair bit of coverage in the past. We've also seen plenty of coverage of other, so-called air protein companies, and I'm doing air quotes as I'm doing air protein. But the reason Sifted is picking up the story now and checking in on this company is that it's sort of getting closer to launching its products onto the market. What closer to launch means in this context is actually part of the article as well. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. But there were a few things that stood out to me here. First of all, what I thought was interesting in listening to the company, the executives at Solar Foods, talk about the potential they see for their protein, which is very versatile. It's sort of taste neutral. Is that they are really not all that interested in using the protein they're creating to make alternatives to meat. There is that assumption, isn't there, that if you are in the alternative protein game, that ultimately what you want is to launch some kind of burger of some description. That is not what they're really all that interested in. They're looking at a much wider range of products that they can potentially use their protein to make or add their protein to, including granolas and baked goods. They have a partnership and, in fact, some investment from a confectionery company as well. And what they're saying is that they feel the meat alternatives market is pretty crowded now, so they are just less interested in playing in that and kind of coming to market with yet another burger. Their protein alternative is also a little bit more expensive, so there's some questions around cost effectiveness as well. The other thing the article focuses on is the regulatory approval process involved in getting new proteins like this to market. So I mentioned at the beginning that this is partly an article to do with looking at how they're going to try and bring the product to market. So far they've got quite some time to go on this. The product hasn't yet been approved by EFSA, the European Food Safety Regulator. So even the journalist writing this article wasn't even able to try the protein for her article. And the EFSA approval process, they say, can take up to 18 months, compared with 3 to 6 months in some other countries, such as the US, which is a source of some frustration for them. They say, this company, Solar Foods, say they feel it's partly because of this lengthy approval process and this delay in getting innovation to market, that they feel Europe doesn't have quite the leadership position in food tech, for example, that it perhaps could have. So I was really interested in that, and I'd love to get your take on this, Murray, and give us a sense of how things are handled in New Zealand, because I think New Zealand has managed to sort of position itself as a country that really punches above its weight, not just in terms of exports, as you've talked about, but also when it comes to food innovation. What's your sense of how quick it is to get innovation to market? And do you think these guys are right to feel a little bit frustrated with that kind of 18-month approval process?
I think they're rightfully aggrieved in just how long it takes. Innovation, it does take time, but I was really interested in the way that they had broken it down, into a series of cycles. I think they talked about 30-month cycles, and then they completed that step and then gone to the next one. Hey, these things, when you're in any startup, it never goes as fast as you want it to, and it always costs much more than you expect that it would. That's just the nature of these things. But hey, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And look, I wish them well. And it's interesting that they've really admitted that it's not cheap, admitted that they're not going to play in the same space as everybody else. And so, yeah, it's interesting. But I suspect it's going to be a long, hard battle, particularly when you're fighting some of the authorities, because the bureaucrats tend to operate at a different pace to any entrepreneur.
What I liked from the article as well, as you've picked out, Julia, is about protein being an ingredient. And we've seen that so much more, haven't we, about, the thing that always springs to mind is Weetabix with protein. And, you go down various aisles and there's added protein. And I always think this is an opportunity for the meat category to be braver about, good source of protein. Well, of course it is, but and I guess dairy to an extent too, that are we missing a trick in those sectors to be a bit more bullish and braver about the benefits of eating those categories when consumers are willing to pay more, and they're going to have to if this ingredient costs to buy a breakfast cereal or whatever it may be, granola with added protein.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, the other thing I have to say, especially in light of the conversation we had about sort of Gen Zs and their attitudes towards technology and how comfortable or not they might feel with some of these alternative proteins. I mean, I totally understand why a startup like this is frustrated with the length of the approval process. And I think those concerns about what that means for Europe's leadership position, I think are well made. On the other hand, from a consumer perspective, I think having that really long, robust approval process can also be a really important part of the story that is needed to kind of reassure consumers that they can feel safe buying into some of these alternative proteins as well. So I guess it's about sort of finding the right balance between something that does allow innovation to come to market in a timely fashion, but at the same time has the kind of regulatory backup that makes consumers feel really good about buying into some of these emerging categories. Laura, what's your second pick for us?
My second pick this week is from The Spoon. It's Consumer Food Waste Innovation Report, and this is an exec summary of a longer read that they've produced on the topic of waste. And I know, I don't know if you both feel like me, but waste seems to come up in our press almost on a weekly basis with a lot of big numbers in there, and it always feels a huge issue that we know the industry has got, but how are we actually going to tackle it? And what I liked about this article and this exec summary was it gave a feel of the numbers, which I'll run through in a second, but it also included some of the things that we could do to help overcome some of the challenges. And that isn't all just about the processing sector, it's about consumers and their role within it. So just to set the context, roughly 1.3 billion tonnes of edible food worldwide is wasted annually each year. And experts say this number will swell to 2.1 million tonnes by 2030. And these figures have well been known in and out of the food industry, but until recently, little has been done to curb the problem, which hits every touch point in the food supply chain, says the article. And it talks about in the developed world, at least, as much of that focus over the last 12 months has been on the consumer kitchen and looking about how we can overcome some of the challenges, which is responsible for most of food waste in the regions of the more developed world, predominantly North America and Europe. The Spoon report examines why food waste in the consumer kitchen and what new technologies and processes can be leveraged to fight waste. And when you think about it, the amount of consumers around the world, we've all got different ways of cooking, and we've talked about it on today's show, different ways that we're now reacting in light of COVID, and we're shopping less but buying more and all these things. How is this impacting, when you get to the end of the week and open your fridge door and think, oh, well, that's gone out of date, or what am I going to do with it? Are we dropping it in the bin? Are we cooking it and making sure we pop it in the freezer? And I guess millions of us, billions of us are all making those individual decisions on a daily basis, which are impacting these figures. So the report highlights a couple of things. 1/3 of the food waste that goes to waste annually in the US and Europe, the majority is downstream, the terminology they use, and is at the consumer facing businesses and in the home. And it talks about new technology and how, and something I really liked in this, how the refrigerator itself may be one of the single biggest contributors to food waste. And moving forwards, can appliance makers consider overhauling the appliance's entire design to help consumers fight food waste? And that's something that I hadn't even considered, and it's nothing that I've picked up before in previous articles. And it profiles articles including Samsung, LG and others, looking about what they can do to help overcome some of these waste challenges and provide solutions. And it talks about solutions for fighting food waste will come from a wide range of different players. From these tech companies, areas of focus will look at smart appliances, more enabled food storage systems, as well as meal planning and meal sharing apps. The article doesn't pull out anything from New Zealand, Murray, and I always think you guys down there are so much better with food. Is that me being naive, but are you guys more planned and look after stuff, and it's just us North Americans and Europeans dropping stuff in the bin at the end of the week? What can we learn? What do you reckon?
I think it's the same everywhere, and the article does talk about more affluent countries actually are the ones that have the highest rate of food waste. And poorer countries, obviously, they look after everything, and if you travel to third world countries, they eat everything, whereas we bin it. The other thing is around, expiry dates, best before, all that sort of thing, when in fact, the simple sniff test will actually give you a fairly good indication as to, how good that product still is. And look, it struck me that was huge. I mean, it was bigger than what I expected. And then when I thought about it, I thought, actually, that's only outside the farm gate as well. So if you actually come inside the farm gate, you'll find it's probably almost as big when you consider that people only want to eat apples of a certain size or shape or whatever, or a cucumber at a certain shape, or, those sort of things. There's a huge amount of wastage which occurs before it even gets off the farm. So that was interesting. The other thing which I wonder a little bit about is that you guys, I'm sure, have got these pre-prepared meal solutions. We have My Food Bag here, I think Blue Apron in the States, things like that, where chefs and that have put together a package, and so you come home and you don't have to think, but it's all delivered, all the ingredients are there. And so actually when you produce that meal, it's done in such a way that there shouldn't really be any waste. So you're not stuck with a fridge full of ingredients which you might use and then throw out later.
And I think what's interesting is certainly when you look at the food waste debate here in the UK, but my sense is something quite similar is happening in countries such as the US as well. So initially, a lot of the sort of consumer-focused communication was very much about how much money you waste if you have high levels of food waste. I think in recent months, that conversation or that narrative has turned much more on the environmental impact. And I think organizations like WRAP are drawing a much more explicit line between how you behave around food waste in the home and your sustainability impact, your environmental footprint. So it's interesting that they've pulled out some of these stats. I definitely see that as part of a sort of wider movement to really not just make it about, hey, you're throwing away lots of money here and you could save, I think, £700 or something like that in the UK a year if you were better about, food waste, but to actually say, if you care about the environment, probably one of the single best things you can do to improve the impact you're having is to waste less food. The other point I thought was interesting, and Laura, you picked up on this as well, is the whole point about refrigeration and sort of next generation fridges. I think that's fascinating. It'll be really interesting to see what the tech companies come up with. What I haven't seen quite as much yet, and I do wonder whether we're going to start seeing this a little bit more in the debate around food waste, is, it's fine to have an expensive new fridge that does all sorts of fancy things to help you with food waste. But of course, we do have a massive problem with food poverty as well, poverty in general. And when people talk about appliance poverty, which is simply not having decent refrigeration, sometimes no refrigeration, no fridge at all, no freezer at all. And freezers, frozen is such a great way to really help reduce food waste. So many households don't have access to that, or they only have incredibly old, inefficient appliances, I really hope that we're going to start seeing more of a debate around the kinds of appliances, never mind the next gen stuff, but the basic appliances that need to be in people's homes, that social and private landlords need to be supplying to tenants to make sure they have the basic equipment to, yes, reduce food waste, but also be able to get the most out of the money they're spending on their food. Murray, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for bringing two really interesting articles that I think made us look at issues we wouldn't normally be looking at. So I think you've definitely broadened our horizons, and I'm sure you'll have broadened our listeners' horizons as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.